If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you know that something I'm really interested in is the science of learning a language. And recently I had the pleasure of talking to Steven Piantadosi, who is the head of the Computation and Language Lab at UC Berkeley. We talked about language acquisition and how children learn vocabulary and artificial intelligence. It was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Steven Piantadosi, thanks so much for joining me today.
Sure, happy to be here.
I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Piantadosi.
Yes, that's right.
So, great. So you are an assistant professor at UC Berkeley.
Right.
And you are the head of the language and computing lab, is that right?
Computation and language lab, yes.
Computation language. So for people who don't know you and your work, could you just talk a little bit about like what you do, really?
Sure, yeah. So most of the people in the lab are interested in understanding learning and learning very broadly. So, how can you build, for instance, learning models or artificial intelligence systems that can learn like people do. And we take that usually to involve figuring out how people do learning and, what kinds of mechanisms they have, how they handle data, what kinds of things they pay attention to in the world, what kinds of theories people consider when they're trying to understand some new system. And we work a lot on understanding language learning and early mathematics learning. So trying to make sense of the kinds of representations that adults have and how kids could start with whatever they start with, whatever a newborn baby starts with, and arrive at the kinds of representations that adults find very, very ordinary and easy to handle.
And I suppose that leads me into sort of your first piece of work, and I have to congratulate you because recently you published a paper which showed that basically all of sort of language that humans know it would fit on a floppy disk, about 1.5 megabytes of information, and I saw this paper everywhere. I saw it on BBC News, I saw it on Facebook, I saw it on Reddit. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, we had been thinking about this question for a while in the lab of trying to quantify exactly how much people know. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of debates that originated both in linguistics and philosophy and early psychology about how much information has to be built in for learners. So what exactly is different between a human and another primate that allows a human to learn language and not another primate, or between a human and a hamster, right, that allows a human to learn language and not a hamster. So there's lots of argument about that, but nobody had gone through and sort of quantified exactly how much information people had to learn. And that's something that you can do by looking at the types of knowledge that adults have and trying to kind of estimate. We did these kind of back of the envelope calculations to try to estimate how much information learners would have had to extract from their environment in order to arrive at the amount of knowledge that adults have about English.
Yeah, and in the paper it shows it has a string of ones and zeros, and it shows that a person, from the time they're born until they're 18 years old, they would is that right? Till they're 18, they would have to learn. They would have to learn a sequence like this every single day for 18 years to acquire a language.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the estimates that we come up with are on the order of hundreds to thousands of bits of information per day. So that's hundreds or thousands of ones and zeros you have to remember. And if you look at 200 ones and zeros, it looks like a huge amount of information to remember. And I think that's right. It is a huge amount. The format of representation for learners is, of course, different than a string of ones and zeros. I mean, the things that they're learning are more naturally connected to the words that they know, word meanings, different syntactic constructions, different speech sounds, and so there's basically cognitive mechanisms for handling those and for encoding information like that. But the total amount of information that those mechanisms are able to extract from the world is, I think, surprisingly large.
Yeah, I mean, it is surprisingly large, but then at the same time, it's sort of, I feel like humans should know more language than just what fits on a floppy disk. I feel like it should be at least like a big hard disk or something, like.
Yeah, it's funny. We had both of those intuitions as we were coming up with these numbers. That on the one hand, it felt like a huge amount per day. If you look at the amount per day to remember, I don't think that you could ever remember, a sequence of zeros and ones like that if you had to do it explicitly, if they were encoded as zeros and ones. And on the other hand, even if you add up that amount of information per day for 18 years, you still don't arrive at something more than a floppy disk would hold. I mean, a megabyte and a half is basically our estimate. One way of making sense of that is maybe that floppy disks actually hold a ton of information.
Yeah, true.
Millions and millions of bytes of information. So, yeah.
Yeah, true. And I'm wondering, because it's interesting what you said before about, it would be very difficult for a human to just learn ones and zeros every single day, but it would be much easier to learn the same amount of information if it was like encoded in maybe a story or something. So,
sure,
so what does that maybe tell us about the language learning process? Does it tell us anything interesting about that?
Yeah, I think that there are certain things which are very natural for people to learn. There are certain pathways which we're very good at absorbing information in. For instance, if I showed you a picture, I could ask you in a week, if I could show it to you again in a week and ask you if it was the same one, and you'd probably be pretty good at recognizing it. But if I encoded that picture as a string of zeros and ones, even though the information might be equivalent, in a week later, you probably wouldn't be able to remember whether you had seen that sequence of zeros and ones. And so just psychologically, there's some formats which are very natural and some which are unnatural. And one of the actually main findings of the paper is that most of that information, almost all of that information, is about word meanings. So it's what different nouns and verbs refer to in the world. It's about their semantics or their dictionary definitions or some kind of representations of their meaning. And I think actually that's one of the formats where people are very, very good at encoding new chunks of information, basically, right? So I could teach you a new word in a single sentence, and you'd be able to remember it for some amount of time. And the amount of information that is required for a single word is non-trivial. It's depending on how you estimate, right? It's maybe a couple hundred bits of information that specifies exactly what the word picks out.
Okay, so for example, if I was learning a language and I had maybe two options for learning vocabulary, I could sort of sit down with a list maybe of 20 words for that day and just try to remember those 20 words. Or I could maybe, is there a better way? Does your research show that there would be a better way to remember those words?
I don't know. So I think that sitting down and memorizing a list is certainly different than how children do it, right? So they're probably picking out pieces of meaning from multiple situations that they encounter in the world, and that means that there's, I guess I think of it as them starting with very fuzzy concepts or very fuzzy word meanings, and as they go around and acquire information, those hone in and they figure out exactly what words mean. So they first might think an uncle is just a male, then they might think, an uncle is actually some kind of older relative who's a male, and then over time they'll figure out, oh no, it's actually an older male relative who's a sibling of one of your parents. And so that kind of refinement of concepts is something that I think happens very naturally in ordinary language learning. I don't know. I don't know enough about, say, second language learning or language learning in adults to know exactly what the best kind of method for teaching and learning might be there. So it easily could be the case, for instance, that adults could sit down every day and learn a couple of words a day just by reading word lists or reading from the dictionary. But that's certainly not what kids do.
Yeah, of course. And well, that's interesting as well, because you wrote a paper which was now I hope I understand this well, but you wrote a piece of software that was able to basically simulate how children learn kinship terms, like how children would learn family words.
Yeah, so that's one of the domains that mainly one of my graduate students, Frank Malika, has been interested in. And it's an interesting domain because words like uncle and grandmother and sibling and things all refer to some kind of structural property on a family tree. So they're in some sense more abstract than a word like chicken or shoes or something, which maps onto some kind of physical objects in the world. So kinship terms pick out some abstract logical relation like that. And in terms of our theories of word learning, there haven't been real computational accounts that can explain that. So a lot of theories of word learning say, you hear a word when there's some kind of thing around, and you learn that association between a word and a thing. So you hear the word chicken when there's chickens around, you hear the word shoe when there's shoes around. And what you do is you form a tight association between those, and that association is kind of the core of your representation. What's interesting for these kinship terms is kids go through a stage that looks kind of like that. So initially they kind of come up with associations on kind of simple perceptual features like age or who's friendly or whatever. And so if you ask a kid of the right age, they'll say, an uncle is an older friendly person who sometimes brings you presents or something like that.
Okay.
And as they continue to accumulate data, meaning probably they hear from their parents what the word means or who it refers to or who it doesn't refer to, they eventually arrive at this more abstract kind of representation that's stated in terms of family relationships. And so we've been interested in modeling that as a kind of cool case study of trying to figure out, how we could formalize and test learning theories that work over kind of abstract family tree-like relationships like that.
Yeah, I get it. It's totally interesting. I never even thought about those sort of putting words in those categories. That, yeah, of course, a chicken is always a chicken. It's a chicken and you can see it. But an uncle could be any man of any age. He could look different. He could have different personalities. It's really interesting. And so you're saying that children kind of start. It's very fuzzy. They maybe know some abstract characteristics and then over time they sort of learn to realize what it means.
Yeah, so in the developmental literature, there's a thing called the characteristic to defining shift. So kids initially pick out kind of characteristic features, like an uncle is friendly and he sees you every now and then, and he's an older male, and they shift from having that kind of representation or belief about word meanings to a defining relationship, which is like the defining relationship that adults know. So being a male sibling of one of your parents, and you can see that not just for uncle, but in lots of different word meanings. So one that gets studied a lot is like a princess, right? You can ask kids, could a princess ever be mean? And kids say, "Oh, no, like, that's not one of the characteristic features of a princess."
Wow.
Or you could describe for them someone who is the daughter of a king, but is really mean and not very wealthy and has tattered clothes and things. And I think, oh no, that can't be a princess.
Wow, that's really interesting.
There's sort of initial guesses about what words mean seem to be driven by these things which are perceptually very accessible, like how you look and how you act. And it's only with more time or more data that they come to understand the more abstract things behind some of these word meanings.
Wow, interesting. Okay, I wanted to ask you about something else, which was in the world of language learning. There's a lot of teachers who insist on their students immediately thinking in the language they're trying to learn. So if you're French and you're trying to learn English, your teacher will probably say to you, okay, I want you to think in English. And I'm curious about your take on this, because I know that you've done some research about the language of thought and what do you think about suggesting that somebody could think in a particular language?
Yeah, so this is a sort of big unknown in terms of cognitive psychology. Is what is the language that we think in? And there's some people that think, there's some people that hypothesize that the language we think in is natural language. So when we have thoughts, they're underlyingly whatever maybe was our first language or our most frequently used language or something. There's other people who hypothesize that there's a separate language, that there's some kind of mentalese that supports reasoning, and that mentalese in some sense has to get translated into the language that we speak. And there's other people who think that there's like it's not even right to talk about mental languages, that there is no language of thought, that there's some other kinds of representations which don't look at all like language. So what it means for something to look like a language is that it has little pieces of meaning, and you form complicated thoughts or ideas by piecing together those little parts of meaning. So a good analogy is like how an English sentence works or how a computer program works. You can express a more complicated idea just by putting pieces together. And that's not at all an established fact in cognitive psychology. I'd say it's one of the more contentious and kind of debated points is to what degree our non-linguistic representations look like that. To what degree they look like something where there's little pieces that are put together.
And is there some type of maybe emerging consensus about one theory or another, one hypothesis or another?
No. I mean, I'd say that most people work in kind of one area or another, and it's very hard to try to connect them. So among the people who don't think that mentalese looks like a language, mostly are people who do neural network modeling. And so these models have, thousands or millions of individual neural units that are meant to be kind of analogous to actual biological neurons, or at least populations of the biological neurons. Okay. And representations there look like a big pattern of activity. And that big pattern of activity is fundamentally a different kind of thing than a string of words. So a lot of the kind of foundational debate in the field has been trying to understand, for instance, how you can get things that act like or seem like biological neurons to process language, for instance, or how things that seem like biological neurons can do some kind of thinking or reasoning without sort of implementing some other kind of mental language. So I'd say that there's not a consensus, and it's one of the hardest issues in the field, I think, to figure out how that works.
Okay, wow. So maybe there's some people out there who are thinking, well, I don't really need to learn a language, because in the next 10 years, Google will have a little thing we can put in our ear, and it will have automatic translation between any language in the world. And, what's the point of learning a language? I mean, how far away do you think we are from that? Do you think it will ever happen? Will it happen in 10 years? I mean...
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that the tools that exist now are pretty good. So you can go to a country where you don't speak the language and get around pretty well with Google's Translate. You have to type in what you want to say or something. But I think that the in-the-ear thing that automatically translates is not that far of a leap of technology. I mean, the speech recognition systems there are there. The translation systems are pretty good. And so I think that if you're interested in, just navigating from the airport to your hotel and then going to buy dinner or something, that's essentially already a solved problem, I think.
Yeah.
If you want to engage in a real conversation about some topic in depth with somebody, then I think it's a bit harder, because I think the translation systems have to be a bit better, and they have to handle unusual topics a bit better than they actually do. So I don't know how long. I mean, I think it depends on sort of how good it has to be.
I mean, obviously you're a person who's interested in language, because you've spent your whole career since you started university. You've spent your whole career working in language, and I mean, how does that, on an emotional level, on a personal level, what do you think of the idea? What do you think of the idea of people maybe not really needing to learn languages? I mean, is that exciting to you, or do you think that's kind of sad?
Yeah, I mean, I'd fall a little. Well, I'd say it's a little bit of both, right? So, if I don't speak Japanese, for instance, but if there was a great translation tool that would let me, travel easier in Japan and engage with more kind of natural Japanese content, then great. That seems like a great thing. At the same time, I mean, I think that there's a lot of value in sort of engaging deeply with another culture, and part of that is often trying to learn the language and understand it. So I think that from that point of view, like there's real knowledge to be gained for individuals in learning languages, but at the same time, it's also like very convenient to have good tools that let you do things.
Yeah, I mean, when I spoke to Daniel Everett about this topic, I sort of asked him. I asked him, like, why should people learn languages? Like, what's the point? Because for a lot of people, you're in your country. Maybe you travel for 2 weeks a year, but you're not doing business. You have no real necessity to learn a language. And he said that in the past, language was taught as a different way to view the world. Language was taught as a different way to think. I mean, what do you sort of? How do you feel about that? Like, what? I know this is more personal opinion than science, but what do you think is the point of learning a language, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a different way to think. That's actually a whole other undeveloped debate in cognitive psychology, is whether people who speak different languages think differently in some fundamental way. But I certainly think it's an important part of understanding a different culture, and anything that gets you out of only knowing about the one culture that you grew up in, I think is very important. So I guess I see it as just a kind of piece of learning about the world and learning about the universe and how other people live and these kind of things.
Okay, cool, excellent. Okay, I've just got a couple more questions. So based on your work with children, and especially, for example, we were talking about before that you have to learn a certain amount of information every day for maybe 18 years, and just based on your knowledge of language acquisition and computing and language acquisition, what do you think about the idea that you could become fluent in 3 months in a language, or that I don't want to name any specific names, but there are companies out there, big companies who are selling products, where they claim that you could learn a language in 5 minutes a day. I mean, how do you, as a scientist, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what exactly you mean by learning a language. So I'm sure you could learn something useful in 5 minutes a day. Probably not fluent, right? Unless you spent a really long time. Kids spend hours and hours a day for a decade or two trying to figure out how their language works. So at the same time, right? Like you could probably acquire something, and so it's a question of kind of what level of competence you'd like to achieve. And there's even studies showing that it's very difficult maybe almost impossible for adults to achieve native-like competence when they're learning language. So there's the critical period hypothesis, which basically says that essentially before puberty, if you learn a language after puberty, it's very hard to achieve real kind of native-like competence. And so there's studies, for instance, of people who have spent you can say, take only people who've been trying to learn a language for 10 years and look at when their ability with it as a function of when they started. And if they started very young, then they'll probably be like native. And if they started older, then the same amount of time, same comparative amount of input probably doesn't get them up to the same level.
Recently there was the paper in Cognition that was with Josh Hartshorn and
that's right,
about that exact thing. And yes, it was very clear that even especially without immersion, an adult learner needs a much longer amount of time. And yes, they never quite get to that same proficiency. Do you have any ideas? Does your research tell us why that might be?
No, I haven't worked on that. There are theories that are out there, though. So some of the older studies before Josh Hartshorn's were done by Lissa Newport, and she has a theory called the less is more hypothesis, which is basically that adults are smarter than kids in a bunch of different ways, and maybe being smarter kind of impedes language learning because it allows you other routes to communicate and to handle language and things. And so maybe the cognitive limitations that kids have are actually an advantage in language learning, and sort of crucially shape the representations that they arrive at.
Wow, I'd never heard of that paper, but I'm going to read it this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm happy to send it to you.
Wow, that's a really interesting idea. That maybe it's true. Like as adults, if I'm in France and I go to the supermarket, I don't really need to say anything. I can, I have the money and I can live, right? There are people who move to another country and live there for 30 years and never learn the language, right?
Yeah.
But children, a child couldn't do that. It's an interesting theory.
Wow.
Wow, interesting. Okay, so just one final question, I suppose.
Sure.
So I'm aware that second language learning and classroom learning is not your area of expertise, but if I'm going to ask you anyway. What would you do? You have any advice for anybody who's trying to learn a language? Maybe there's something which you feel like could be solid advice for people who really want to get fluency.
That's a good question. I think immersion, and I think really forcing yourself to engage with the language as opposed to using these other ways of getting around things probably helps a lot. So, if you're visiting a country and you could buy a train ticket by pointing at something, right, that's not going to help you learn the language. If you force yourself to try to speak it, then maybe you'll say something incorrect. But, people are very robust to communicating successfully with someone who doesn't quite have the right grammar or quite have the right pronunciation. So I think that people often feel very self-conscious about making mistakes, and that's something that, if you're really trying to learn the language, you should just try to ignore as best you can.
Yes, the language learning process is mostly making mistakes, right? Making mistakes, looking stupid, but you're right. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm sure that
thank you.
I would love to talk to you all day, but I know you're a busy man. So I'm just going to leave it here and thank you very much for your time.
Cool. Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, sir.